The wilderness holds secrets that defy reason, where silence can feel alive and shadows move with intelligence, and every step might bring you closer to something beyond understanding. In this video, you'll witness 6 terrifying encounters from a 5-person documentary crew attacked deep in an Idaho forest to a Transylvanian family's dog returning trembling amid enormous, inexplicable footprints. Each story revealing moments when the ordinary became dangerously extraordinary. The forest in northern Idaho had been still for most of the day, heavy with the heat of July 10th, 2025, the kind of oppressive warmth that made the air seem thicker and the shadows beneath the pines seem deeper. The 5-person documentary crew had worked since sunrise, setting up cameras along narrow game trails, recording the movements of elk, foxes, and birds, their laughter and chatter swallowed by the towering trees. As evening settled in, a wall of clouds began to build in the distance, moving silently until the first low rumbles of thunder rolled through the valleys. They retreated to camp, the air carrying the sharp, metallic tang that came before rain, and the forest growing unnervingly quiet, except for the faint creak of swaying branches. When darkness fell, the first drops began to patter against the taut nylon of their tents, the rain growing heavier until it was a deafening roar, punctuated by sudden gusts of wind that tore at the guy lines and made the treetops whip and shudder. It was in the middle of this storm that the strange, low thuds began, faint at first, as if something massive was moving carefully through the undergrowth, each sound too deliberate to be mistaken for falling branches. The wind masked the direction, causing the crew to turn their heads in confusion. Their flashlights sliced through the wet night, only to reveal sheets of rain and shifting shadows. The first scream was cut short by a sharp, guttural impact, followed by the sound of tearing fabric as one of the tents collapsed inward. Figures moved in the strobing light of the storm. Still, they were only glimpses, the flash of something impossibly tall, moving between trees, the broad silhouette of shoulders far wider than any man's, the way it seemed to bend and flow with a disturbing quickness despite its size. The crew scrambled, grabbing at gear and each other, but the wind and rain turned the ground into slick mud, making every step uncertain, and the darkness pressed against them like a living thing. The creature did not rush. It struck, retreated, and struck again, using the storm to its advantage, each attack coming from a new angle, tearing through the thin nylon walls of the tents as if they were paper. Heavy, wet breathing could be heard just beyond the beams of the flashlights, followed by the sharp crack of branches breaking under tremendous weight. The air reeked of something musky and primal, a scent that seemed to choke the breath from their lungs. One of the crew went down with a strangled cry, dragged partway into the dark, before a second figure lunged to pull them back, both vanishing from sight as the rain intensified into a white curtain. The only one who escaped the attack was Jack, a lean man in his early 30s who had been on the far edge of the camp, his tent partially shielded by a large boulder. He saw enough to know that this was not a bear, nor any other predator native to these woods. The way it moved was almost calculated, each attack separated by moments of stillness, as if it were studying them, learning their reactions, and altering its approach. When it turned toward him, he caught the faint outline of its head and shoulders against a flash of lightning, the slope of its brow, the thickness of its arms, and the uncanny sense that it was watching him with purpose. Fear broke through the numb shock, and Jack ran, slipping and stumbling through the sucking mud, branches whipping his face and arms as he pushed blindly through the storm. The forest seemed endless, every sound distorted by the wind, until the faint orange glow of the ranger station's porch light appeared through the trees like a beacon. He burst inside, soaked and shaking, unable to form more than fragmented descriptions of what had happened, his words tumbling over each other in a rush of disbelief and terror. At first light, a team of rangers and medics set out, the rain having eased to a steady drizzle that made the forest smell rich and earthy, masking the faint copper tang of blood until they reached the camp. The scene was chaotic, tents shredded into long ribbons, gear strewn across a 50-foot radius, footprints obliterated by the storm, but heavy impressions still visible in the soft ground near the largest tent. All 5 crew members were found alive but injured, their arms and legs bearing deep scratches and bruises, some consistent with the marks of blunt force, others harder to classify. None could give a coherent account of what had attacked them, their memories fractured between flashes of movement, the feel of powerful hands or claws, and the sense of being herded rather than hunted. Officials later suggested the storm and fatigue had heightened panic, leading to disorientation and injury, with perhaps a bear or multiple smaller predators drawn in by the smell of food. Yet Jack's words told a different story, of a towering figure that never fully revealed itself, that seemed to strike with intent, then vanish into the trees before they could react. He spoke of eyes that caught the light in a way that made his skin crawl, and of the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath in those moments between attacks. Locals were less inclined to dismiss the account. Among them, the stretch of woods where the attack occurred already carried a reputation, with hunters and hikers whispering about unnatural silences, missing dogs, and shadows that moved against the wind. They claimed the trees there grew in subtle, unsettling patterns, the clearings perfectly circular, as though shaped by something with design rather than nature. To them, the attack was just another warning, proof that some parts of the forest were not meant for people to linger in, especially at night, and especially during storms. The crew never returned to finish their documentary. Their gear, what little was recovered intact, was left unclaimed in the ranger station's storage shed. And while the official report remains a short, dry account of a storm, injuries, and probable wildlife disturbance, the survivor still swears he remembers that figure in the rain, watching and waiting with the patience of something that knew the forest was entirely its own. The wilderness in northern Canada stretched for hundreds of miles without a road or power line, a rolling, endless expanse of pine forest and glacial lakes where the silence could seem almost alive. Matt Abbott had thrived in places like this for years, moving through remote terrain with the ease of someone who had learned the land's moods, its dangers, and its small, hidden rhythms. For this trip in late August 2021, he had set out alone, traveling deep into an area known for its isolation, where the nearest human might be days away, and the nights were so dark that even the stars seemed reluctant to touch the ground. When the search team found his camp, it was clear something had gone wrong, but not in the way they expected. The fire pit was cold, ash scattered slightly, as though the wind had moved it. Yet there were no signs of recent storms. His tent lay collapsed, one corner still anchored, but the others folded inward, as though it had been pressed down in a single movement rather than blown over. The ground showed no signs of struggle, no drag marks or torn earth, just the odd stillness of a place abandoned too quickly for reason. It was the placement of his belongings that made the scene truly unsettling. His backpack, still zipped, rested across the fork of a pine branch more than 12 feet above the ground. A pair of water bottles sat upright in the branches of another tree, perfectly balanced, untouched by animal teeth or claws. Other supplies, his compass, his folding knife, even his gloves, were positioned high above, each in its own branch, as though placed there deliberately and with great care. Nothing was spilled, scattered, or damaged, which ruled out the idea of scavengers or high winds. Scattered in the trampled grass near the tent were the pages of a small notebook, the writing warped from damp but still legible. Some pages contained neat lists of supplies and sketches of the surrounding terrain, the kind of details any survivalist might record. Others, however, were filled with frantic lines that spiraled into near illegibility, jagged sketches of towering, indistinct shapes drawn in heavy strokes, their proportions unnatural, their limbs too long, their shoulders hunched and shadowed. Between these drawings were short, rushed notes that repeated certain phrases, warnings about being watched, about movement in the tree line, about something that avoided light and sound, yet never left him alone. A few yards beyond the camp, the team found footprints. At first glance, they seemed like the impressions of a large boot, but the shape was wrong. The heel too narrow, the front too wide, the overall length stretching nearly 20 inches. The prints moved away from the tent in a straight line toward the denser forest, their spacing suggesting a stride far longer than any human could make. They continued for roughly 40 feet before stopping abruptly on a patch of soft earth, with no sign of where the weight had gone next. No broken branches, no disturbed moss, no secondary tracks leading away. It was as if the maker of the prints had stepped out of the world entirely. Authorities mounted an extensive search, bringing in helicopters, tracking dogs, and teams that moved slowly through the pine stands, calling his name and marking every potential trail. They found nothing, no torn clothing, no dropped gear, no traces of a body. The lack of any scent trail baffled the dog handlers, who noted that it was as though Abbott had never moved beyond the footprint site at all. The official explanation, offered quietly and with the distant tone of those trying to close a case, was that he had become disoriented and wandered away from his camp. In such wilderness, a single wrong turn could lead to miles of hopeless wandering, the cold nights and scarce food ensuring that the forest would take what it wanted. Yet this failed to explain the deliberate placement of his belongings high in the trees, a task requiring strength, reach, and time that seemed incompatible with panic or disorientation. Nor could it explain the abrupt end of the enormous footprints or the strange, frantic notes. Locals, many of whom had never met Abbott but understood the land as he did, were less inclined to dismiss the stranger elements. They spoke of an unmarked region beyond the northernmost lakes, where hunters complained of hearing heavy, unhurried footsteps pacing them from the tree line, and where campfires seemed to dim without wind. They told of nights when no animals stirred, when the usual background hum of insects and distant bird calls vanished, leaving only the sound of the blood in your own ears. To them, Abbott's disappearance was not an accident, but the inevitable outcome of drawing the attention of something that tolerated human presence only for so long. Search efforts continued for 2 weeks before they were called off. The last teams returned empty-handed, leaving the camp untouched except for the removal of his personal notes and some of the higher-placed gear. The rest was left behind, still lodged in the branches, as if waiting for someone to retrieve it. Months later, the forest reclaimed what it could, the tent collapsing further under snow, the fire pit buried in needles, the notebook paper curling and softening until the ink bled into blurred shapes. The gear in the branches remained for longer, swaying in the wind until it too vanished, whether by human hand or something else. For those who knew of him, Abbott's name became another in a quiet list of skilled outdoorsmen who had walked into the remote wild and never returned. His disappearance carried none of the mess or chaos that usually marked tragedy in the wilderness. No sign of injury, no sign of struggle, only the deliberate, almost ceremonial arrangement of his possessions, the silent ending of an untraceable trail, and the suggestion, left in frantic sketches, that something had been watching him long before he realized he was not alone. The lake lay hidden among the northern Maine forests, its surface often as smooth as glass beneath the shifting summer mist, and it was here that Oliver Johnson had spent most mornings, since retiring from the logging trade decades earlier. At 72, his movements were slower but deliberate, each step measured on the worn dock boards, his small rowboat as familiar as his own hands. He preferred fishing alone, far from the noise of roads or other boats, often staying out until the light began to dim and the air took on the smell of cooling water. When his body was found on June 28, 2019, the scene carried a stillness that unsettled even the most seasoned warden. The rowboat floated a few yards from the dock, unmoving despite the breeze, its oars pulled in and resting across the seats. Johnson lay slumped against the hull, his head tilted back, eyes locked wide at the pale sky above, his mouth frozen in the shape of a breath that had never returned. His skin was chilled, but not yet mottled with the deeper colors of long submersion, suggesting he had been pulled from life in the hours before dawn. The water surrounding the boat was wrong in a way that could not easily be explained. It moved with a sluggish heaviness, and in the dim light, an oily sheen shimmered across the surface, its colors shifting faintly before thinning and vanishing within hours. No wind stirred the reeds along the shore, and even the loons, whose calls usually carried across the water, were silent that morning. The mist seemed to cling lower than usual, curling around the hull as if reluctant to leave. On the dock, faint impressions marked the weathered planks. They were wet, but not from spray, as the boards near them were dry, and the shape was unfamiliar, elongated and narrow at the heel, wide at the forefoot, with a length that dwarfed even the largest boot size. The trail continued onto the shore, where the mud was softer, and here the prints became unmistakable in their size and depth, spaced in strides far longer than a man could manage. They led straight from the tree line to the dock, each impression clean and undisturbed, until the last one disappeared into the mist near the edge of the water, where no splash or drag mark hinted at how the weight had left the ground. Inside the rowboat, Johnson's fishing gear was laid out with an orderliness that did not match the sudden violence of drowning. The tackle box was closed, the rods aligned neatly along the side, the small cooler latched shut, its contents untouched. There was no sign of a fall, no tangled line, no overturned bucket that might have suggested panic or haste. Everything suggested a man who had paused in the middle of preparation, yet the wide, frozen shock in his face told a story that none of the objects could. Authorities moved quickly to establish the cause, noting the cold water and Johnson's age. Misadventure, they said, perhaps a sudden cramp, a slip from the seat, or a moment of dizziness that sent him under. The stillness of the lake and the sheen on the water were dismissed as coincidental, the footprints as likely distortions from uneven boards and soft mud, their unusual size an effect of melting impressions. Locals were slower to accept such explanations. On the night before Johnson was found, several camps around the lake had reported hearing deep, rhythmic splashes carrying across the mist, the sound too heavy for a fish and too deliberate for wind against the shore. Some had woken to faint, resonant vocalizations, low enough to be felt more than heard, the kind of sound that made the hair at the nape stand upright. One family camping on the far bank claimed they had heard whisper-like rustlings from the tree line each time they approached the water after nightfall, as if something moved with them in the shadows, never close enough to see yet always within reach of the sound. For days after the discovery, the dock and shore remained roped off, but the footprints lingered in the softer ground beyond, the impressions holding their shape through sun and dew. Then, without wind or rain to wash them away, they were gone, each print erased in a single night, the mud beneath them left smooth and untouched. No one could explain how the impressions had vanished so completely without the surrounding earth being disturbed. Weeks passed, and the lake's stillness became more pronounced in memory than in reality. Yet those who had been there on that morning could not quite shake the sense that the place had altered in some unseen way. Fishermen began to avoid the dock at dawn, choosing instead to launch from the opposite side where the water felt warmer, more ordinary. At night, the mist still crept low over the surface, and some swore they saw it moving in patterns that suggested something large passing beneath. Oliver Johnson was buried in the small town cemetery, his life remembered in the quiet words of neighbors who spoke more of his skill on the water than of the circumstances of his death. But in the homes nearest the lake, the details remained. How the gear had been placed so precisely in the boat, how the water had felt heavy under the hand. The footprints had ended not in the water, but in the mist itself. And though the official report remains a tidy account of an accident in cold water, some will not go near that dock again, believing that what had come from the tree line for Johnson had not been finished with the lake, and that the same stillness might be waiting for anyone who stayed out there too long. The northern Vermont lake had always been unpredictable in the early hours, its surface sometimes still and welcoming, other times veiled in a thick mist that swallowed everything beyond a few yards. On that July morning in 2022, the fog lay heavy, its edges curling low over the water, muting the calls of loons and deadening the faint sounds of movement from the shore. Amy, Harry, and Cole, three friends in their late 20s, had set out from a small cove before sunrise, their kayak gliding easily over the glassy water, each paddle stroke sending ripples into the pale whiteness. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic dip of paddles. The air was cool, damp enough to bead on their jacket, and every sound felt close and strange, as though the fog bent it inward. It was Cole who noticed the first splash, deep and resonant, somewhere off to their right. A second followed almost immediately to their left, closer, the water shuddering just beyond their reach. They stopped paddling for a moment, listening, the silence that followed feeling heavier than before. Then another splash, this one directly behind them, loud enough to rattle the thin hull. The pattern of the splashes was deliberate, moving in a slow, circling rhythm that tightened as the moments passed. Shadows began to shift beneath the kayak, their shapes just distorted enough by the rippling water to hide their true outlines. They were large, moving with a smoothness that suggested powerful control rather than the erratic speed of fish. At times, a dark shape would slide forward before drifting back into the fog, its movement hidden until another splash announced its reappearance on the opposite side. Then came the first physical contact. A thick, hairy arm, only a brief glimpse through the swirling fog and refracted water, brushed along the side of the kayak, the coarse texture felt through the thin hull, followed by a sudden push that rocked the boat hard enough to send Harry's paddles skidding across the surface. They scrambled to regain balance, but before they could recover, another surge pressed against the opposite side, this time lingering, as though testing the weight and stability of the craft. They began paddling toward where they believed the shore to be, but the water felt different now, the kayak dragging as if the lake itself resisted their effort. Each stroke seemed to yield less distance than it should, and every few moments, a subtle current pushed them at an angle, redirecting them without visible cause. The fog thickened, the light shifting in strange ways, making it impossible to track direction by the faint outlines of trees. Beneath them, the shadows kept pace, sometimes splitting, sometimes joining again, their movements too synchronized to be random. There were moments when the disturbances felt almost playful, a gentle nudge that spun them slowly, a soft swell that lifted and set them down again. But beneath that playfulness was an undeniable edge, the sense of something large enough to control the interaction entirely. The kayak's thin hull vibrated with the force of movements just beneath, and once, for a few heartbeats, the water on one side bulged upward, as though something massive had risen just below the surface before sliding away again. The sounds grew stranger as the fog thinned in places, not voices exactly, but resonant pulses that seemed to echo inside their chests more than in their ears. The splashes shifted to quick, heavy slaps of water, and now the shadows moved faster, darting just beyond reach before vanishing again. By then, Their paddling had become frantic, their strokes uncoordinated, driven by the primal need to reach solid ground. Yet each time they thought they were gaining ground, the current pulled them back toward the center of the mist, holding them in a pocket where the air felt colder and the water's surface trembled with unseen motion. When they finally broke free of the current, it was not through their own effort, but as if the resistance beneath them had simply ceased. The kayak surged forward with sudden ease, carrying them through thinning fog until they glimpsed the darker shapes of the shoreline trees. They reached the shallows and tumbled into the water, dragging themselves onto the muddy bank where they collapsed, gasping, their clothes heavy with lake water and their limbs trembling with cold and exhaustion. By mid-morning, a small group of locals had found them, drawn by the overturned kayak that was still drifting just offshore. They helped the three to their feet, but the friends could give no clear explanation of what had happened, their descriptions halting and filled with the kind of disbelief that suggested they still could not fully trust their own memories. All they could agree on was the feeling of being herded, of something controlling the water beneath them, and of movements that were neither random nor entirely hostile, just deliberate, curious, and impossibly aware. Authorities arrived later, noting the fog, the cool water temperature, and the early hour. Their conclusion was straightforward. Strong currents, wind, and the onset of mild hypothermia had created the sensation of being pulled off course, while the fog had distorted sounds and shapes, making ordinary disturbances feel threatening. The possibility of hallucination was suggested, and the case was filed away without further investigation. The local fishermen were less convinced. Those who worked the lake had long spoken of mornings when the fog would sit lower than usual, and when the water seemed to hold its breath, every ripple absorbed into the stillness. Some claimed to have felt the same unseen nudges against their boats, while others refused to fish anywhere near that section at dawn. They spoke of the sense of being shadowed from below, of hearing faint disturbances that matched the rhythm of their paddles, and of the uneasy knowledge that something could keep pace with them without ever breaking the surface. For Amy, Harry, and Cole, the lake was no longer a place for leisure. They did not return to retrieve their kayak, leaving it for the water to claim instead. And while their account remains a quiet curiosity in official files, the fishermen speak of it with a certain caution, knowing that whatever moved beneath that fog had chosen to let them go, and that not every visitor might be given the same choice. The fog lay heavy over the remote Siberian highway, a dense, shifting curtain that dulled the headlights and swallowed the world beyond the narrow strip of cracked asphalt. Ben Nelson had been driving for hours on December 5th, 2012. His eyes were sore from the strain, his body tired from the endless monotony of winter roads, the forest pressing in on either side like an unbroken wall of darkness. The silence outside felt ancient and vast, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the faint rattle of loose gear in the back seat. He kept his speed low, wary of the frost-slicked surface, yet the road felt emptier than any he had driven, a place where help would be measured in hours, not minutes, if something went wrong. He had just rounded a long bend when the shadows ahead shifted, and something massive and dark darted across the road in a single fluid motion. There was no time to think, no space to swerve. He slammed the brakes, but the tires slid on the icy surface, and the impact came with a deafening, sickening crunch. The steering wheel wrenched violently in his hands. The front of the vehicle shuddered, and metal screamed as the car veered sideways and smashed against the guardrail with a force that rattled his teeth. For a few seconds, there was only the hiss of the radiator and the thundering of his own pulse in his ears. When the fog thinned enough for him to see the crumpled hood, his stomach twisted. The front bumper had been pushed inward almost to the windshield. The left headlight shattered, The metal bent and torn as if something impossibly strong had hit it head-on. Yet there was no sign of fur, blood, or any trace of what he had struck, only the faint smell of damp earth carried on the cold air. His hands trembled as he unlatched the seatbelt and stepped out, his boots sinking into the wet ground at the edge of the road. The fog seemed to cling to him as he walked toward the impact point, his flashlight beam cutting a pale path through the murk. That was when he saw them, huge impressions in the soft mud on the shoulder, each one shaped like a barefoot, with a clear heel and long, splayed toes, the edges sharp as if they had been made moments before. He crouched down, his breath clouding in the beam of light, and felt the weight of disbelief press against his thoughts. These prints were far too large for a human, yet they lacked the claws of a bear, and they were spaced in a way that suggested something upright and powerful had moved through here with impossible speed. The forest beyond loomed like a wall of shadow, and his light barely reached the first row of trees, where deep gouges scored the bark at heights far above his head. Some trunks bore long, vertical scratches, fresh enough that pale wood showed beneath the torn outer layers, as if something massive had dragged claws or thick nails along them in passing. He stood there for a moment, the stillness pressing down on him, before a faint sound rose from the depths of the trees, a dull, rhythmic thud, fading into the distance, like footsteps too heavy to belong to any man. By the time the distant glow of headlights cut through the fog, he had moved back toward the wreck, relieved to see the flashing lights of a small police truck. The officers stepped out, their breath steaming in the cold air, and began looking over the damage with practiced eyes. They asked the usual questions: speed, visibility, whether he had been drinking, and he told them what he had seen. The words felt strange leaving his mouth, the memory of the towering shadow still fresh, the way it had moved with a strange, silent swiftness before vanishing into the trees. One of the officers crouched to examine the print, his brow furrowing, but when he stood, he only said that a bear could have crossed the road in the fog, startled by the vehicle's approach. Ben looked at him. Knowing the scale of the damage and the height of those tree marks made that explanation impossible. Yet the officer's tone left no room for debate. The prints, he said, would likely be gone by morning, washed out by the wet ground and the constant mist. No photographs were taken, no casts made, and after a brief discussion, they called for a tow truck to haul the car to the nearest settlement. Ben stood on the edge of the road while they worked, his eyes drifting to the darkness between the trees. The fog there seemed deeper, almost alive, as if holding its breath, and he could not shake the feeling that something was still watching from the shadows, hidden just beyond sight. The scratches on the trunks glistened faintly where the bark had been stripped away, and the impressions in the mud looked just as sharp as they had when he first found them. When the tow truck finally pulled the ruined vehicle away, its taillights fading into the fog, Ben climbed into the back of the police truck for the long ride to the nearest station. The heater blasted warm air into the cab, but his hands still felt cold. The image of those prints burned into his thoughts. He knew what he had seen: broad shoulders, a towering frame, and movement that seemed almost too fluid for something so large. Yet without proof, his account would be nothing more than a strange story told on a lonely winter road, another fragment of rumor to drift among the villages along this stretch of Siberia. In the weeks that followed, word spread among locals that something unusual had happened on that highway. Though the official version remained simple, a bear startled a passing driver in poor visibility, causing an accident. Still, truckers began avoiding that section after dark, and those who had no choice but to pass through claimed to feel the weight of unseen eyes following their vehicles until the forest finally fell away in the rear-view mirror. Some swore they heard heavy steps pacing the tree line just out of sight. Others said they caught glimpses of a shape that seemed too tall to be a man and too silent to be a bear. Ben never returned to that road. In his mind, the fog, The prints and the deep scratches on the trees were etched in unshakable detail, reminders that somewhere in the endless frozen wilderness, something vast and unrecorded moved under the cover of night, leaving only faint traces for those unlucky enough to cross its path. The Transylvanian village lay quiet under the first light of summer, its narrow streets lined with weathered houses and gardens filled with the scent of earth and wildflowers. But in the yard of Anka and Dan's home, a tension hung heavy that even the sun could not dissipate. It was the morning of June 2nd, 2025. Anka and Dan's teenage son, Andrei, had already gone out to check the fence when Anka stepped onto the porch, drawn by the uneasy stillness that had settled over their small property. The dog, usually bounding along the fence line and barking at passing birds, was nowhere to be seen. The gate was latched as always, the chain secure, and the yard showed no sign of disturbance. The family searched immediately, scanning the surrounding area. The grass still damp with overnight dew, the dirt firm underfoot, but there was no trace of the dog. The woods at the edge of the property, dense with pines and thorny underbrush, stretched into shadow, and the soft undergrowth muffled the path beyond the yard. Every few minutes, a rustle of leaves or a snap of a twig set their hearts racing, each sound magnified by the tension that seemed to cling to the air itself. Despite calling the dog's name repeatedly, only the quiet rustle of the wind in the trees answered, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible scent of something musky, earthy, and unsettling. The first night passed with uneasy sleep, every shadow in the corners of the yard magnified, every breeze a warning. Andrei lay awake, listening for the familiar thump of paws on the wooden deck, but none came. The family tried to reason through the possibilities. An animal from the forest had frightened the dog, perhaps a fox or a wild boar, or it had wandered into the deeper woods after a sudden distraction. But none of these explanations satisfied the gnawing fear that something larger, something deliberate, had brushed against the boundaries of their yard. On the second night, just before midnight, the dog returned. It emerged from the edge of the forest, wet and trembling, its fur matted and clumped with mud and debris from whatever dense underbrush it had pushed through. The scent of wet earth and pine resin clung to it, stronger than anything the family had smelled in their own yard. Its eyes were wide, alert, and unblinking, reflecting the porch light as if it had seen something that left an indelible mark on its memory. Every muscle in its small body was tense, the fur along its spine standing on end as it shook itself off in short, shuddering movements, careful to stay close to the safety of the fence. When Dan moved closer, his boots sinking slightly in the soft soil, he noticed the prints around the yard. At first glance, they seemed like the impressions of an oversized human, but the proportions were wrong. Each footprint was elongated, with a narrow heel and long, splayed toes that no human foot could achieve. The impressions varied slightly in depth, suggesting that the creature that had made them shifted its weight deliberately, and some prints pressed partially into the soft soil near the fence, implying careful movement rather than reckless motion. They led from the tree line at the edge of the forest, traced in a semicircle around the yard, and then returned toward the woods again, ending just at the underbrush, leaving no other visible trace of departure. Neighbors reported hearing something during the same night, guttural growls that seemed to resonate from deep within the forest, low and measured, echoing between the trees with a rhythm that made the hair at the nape of the neck stand on end. The sound was not continuous, but deliberate, pausing between notes as though whatever produced it were observing and calculating its following action. Windows rattled slightly from the resonance, and even those who dismissed local legends about the forest's strange denizens admitted to a deep unease in the morning. a sense that something massive had moved through their world undetected. Officials investigated, walking the yard and examining the prints, the soil still damp from evening moisture. They suggested ordinary explanations. A wild animal had frightened the dog and left its own tracks. Or perhaps the dog had run off and returned naturally, the prints distorted by rain and soft soil. But the family could not reconcile these explanations with what they had seen. The dog's behavior was not that of a creature simply lost or scared by small predators. It had returned soaked, exhausted, and alert, as if it had fled from something enormous and intelligent, something capable of moving without breaking branches or leaving large signs of weight except where it wanted to. For the next few nights, the family stayed alert. Andrei slept lightly, listening for the rustle of the forest and the faint echo of the growls that had so unsettled the neighbors. Anka checked the locks on the gate repeatedly, feeling the faint pressure of unease each time she returned to the porch. Dan inspected the yard during daylight, noting the subtle shifts in soil and the slight depressions near the forest that suggested careful, calculated movement, rather than the frantic rush of a smaller predator. Each day, the shadows along the edge of the woods seemed heavier, the air thicker, as if waiting for something that had already been there, watching and lingering without leaving its full presence behind. The dog never strayed again, remaining close to the family, its eyes always shifting toward the forest, ears pricked at every distant sound. Locals advised keeping it indoors at night, warning that the forest in that area had long been a place where strange occurrences were whispered about, shadows that moved against the wind, prints too large for any known animal, and presences that seemed aware of every human action. The family followed the advice, though each night the wind carried faint echoes of growls and movement from the edge of the yard, as though the unseen watcher was still there, just beyond reach, aware, patient, and deliberate. Despite the official dismissal of any threat, the unease persisted. Each time a breeze passed through the yard, or the dog stiffened at the tree line, the family felt the presence of something enormous and intelligent, a silent observer that had moved past their perimeter without needing doors or gates. The prints in the soil faded over time, partially eroded by rain, but the memory of their size and shape, combined with the dog's terrified behavior, remained vivid in the family's minds. The forest had brushed against their lives and retreated, leaving only questions, impressions, and the knowledge that not all that existed in the darkness could be explained by ordinary means.